This is a map. It's not a very good map, unless the goal of the map maker was to scare people into ever even thinking of driving through London in a car. So this is a mapping. My dad used to make these, still does in fact, on little bits of paper he'd attach to the dashboard with blue tack, highlights of the journey, important intersections surrounded in red rectangles. And what it effectively does is it selects, plots, and connects important information. So I'd like you to bear that in mind, that distinction, the map and the mapping, as I ask the question, what makes a good map? Well, I started thinking about this a few years ago because I'd noticed, along with some colleagues, that maps and information graphics seem to be everywhere, as we've seen a lot of them today, in fact. And so we started working on a book about the emergence of mapping, and we started to notice it was seemed to be a kind of response to the information explosion, because we learned that there are 20 billion neurons in the brain that enable you to compare patterns visually. And we also realized that there are a lot of people that think the sole criterion of a good map is its usability. And this is their paradigm, the Harry Beck London Underground map of 1933. So what Beck did was he took the earlier map, the 1932 map, which showed London's underground as this tangled mess, and he straightened out the lines, equalized the distances between the stations. His reasoning being that when you're underground, it doesn't really matter exactly where the stations are. You just need to know how to get from A to B. So all the other irrelevant information is removed. Usability people then say, that's all that matters. But then there's a whole other contingent of scientific visualization people. And these guys are interested not in so much, the usability isn't the chief criterion. What is the main criterion is accuracy, precision, and comprehension. They're interested in the data speaking for itself. And these folks like to get the biggest and most powerful computers and the largest, most high-resolution monitors and fill walls with them, as they do up at the street at the Texas Advanced Computing Center. This is their map of the BP oil spill last year. Unusually, it's quite pretty. The scientific visualization people don't normally care about things like prettiness. Aesthetics is rather secondary to the data. And then there are the artists, and I'd like to lump the amateurs in with those too. And the artists, or those who love map art, do care about aesthetics, but not just aesthetics in the sense of prettiness. They like aesthetics in the sense of the sublime. Can a map somehow move you? Can it tell you something about the human condition? Can it say something critical about what we call information? Whose information gets to count as information? This is Stephen von Woolley's map, The Burger Force. It plots the dominance of McDonald's, of the burger chains. All the others are represented with different colors. And you'll notice Sonic is that kind of mayonnaise spill over Texas. The Republic of Sonic. Weirdly, none of these people, the scientific visualization people, the art people, and the usability people, have paid that much attention to what geographers have to say about maps. And geographers, you would think, would know a thing or two about maps. In fact, for several decades, geographers have been telling us that maps lie. They distort. On the very basic level, a map can't show everything about a territory, or it wouldn't be a map. It would be the territory itself. Then they have to start selecting things, pulling things out, distorting things, generalizing things. Well, distorting is not a word they use. The acceptable word is displacement or smoothing, enhancement. And it starts to get to be a problem if, say, you're driving down the 104 outside Rochester and you're trying to make a right onto the 590, and the map tells you it's a straight right, but when you actually get there, you find this horrible tangle of roads, and you've got to come off the freeway and go all around the houses to get back on the freeway. It's a bit like, when you're on the 290 and you're trying to go south in Austin, similar kind of thing. This map also distorts, as I pointed out earlier. It doesn't tell you what happens above ground. It tells you what happens underground. So if you try to use it to navigate above ground, you're going to get unstuck. There's a couple of stations that will take you 25 minutes to get between them on the underground. It'd take you 2 minutes above ground because they're across the street from each other. Also, this map has kind of started to prescribe London for Londoners. Cognitive maps in studies have emerged from Londoners, where they started to draw the city with the central line there and the northern line, instead of mapping the city as it really is. They see the city in terms of this map. And if your property is not on the map, then it's likely to be of a lower, your house price is likely to be lower than if you're on the map. It gets much more pernicious when you get to the history of cartographic crimes, and the most famous one is the Makita projection. Makita was a Flemish cartographer in the 16th century, and as most of us know, the Earth is round, and not a rectangle, as shown here. But if you want to show the Earth as a rectangle, you're going to have to distort something. So Makita, being a European, decided to put Europe at the center of the world. Now, Europe isn't at the center of the world, though I like to think it is. So he moved Europe at the center, moved the equator down, and that had the effect of distorting the continents toward the poles. And it started to cease to describe the world, and over the centuries, it became an objective map of the world. We thought of it as objective that began to prescribe the world, and we started to even think that those southern continents were somehow below us in the north. Same thing happened with the 1856 map of Africa that was drawn up by Heinrich Kiepert. It hung on the wall during the Bismarck Conference, which is when all the European powers were duking it out to get a slice of Africa. You'll notice in the middle of the map is this big white space, not because there was nothing there, but because the people who commissioned the map didn't know or didn't care to know what was there, because if you want to march into Africa and grab the land, it's quite useful, it serves your purposes to present the land as a big load of nothing. So this raises the question, why haven't we listened to geographers, and what have geographers got to tell us? Well, what they've got to tell us really is we should stop asking the question, is the map good or bad, and ask the question, what was the process? What was the agenda behind the map? Was it a good mapping? An architect, the landscape architect, James Corner, has gone one step further and argued that that process, that mapping itself, can be quite a creative process. It can be, it's this complicated research process that he outlines here, but it's also, as he puts it, a collective enabling activity, that mapping. An example is the High Line. That's a park in New York City that was developed out of a disused rail line. James Corner worked on this with Dilla Scofidio and Renfro. And it began with a mapping. The photographer, Joel Sternfeld, started around 2000 climbing up to this disused rail line that runs through the west side of Manhattan and photographing it through the seasons, noting this strange beauty of this deserted place. Also noting how many plants seem to have seeded themselves there. So James, what happened was this idea that this place was quite special, got some traction. Some artists caught on to the idea and started campaigning that instead of this elevated line being pulled down, it should be turned into a public park. James Corner was hired to do the job and started similarly mapping the existing infrastructure, looking at the old rail lines and all the stuff that makes up this crumbling thing, and included in his mapping of the stakeholders the actual plantings, because plants really are stakeholders too. You might think of them as weeds, but those self-seeding plantings were actually native and quite beautiful. And what they ended up with is this incredible oasis in the middle of the city that, because it's elevated, it provides this, if you like, voyeuristic vantage point to the city's midriff. When the crunch gymnastics is sort of mid-level and you see people all working out. So the project emerged out of not the architect's studio, but out of the ground conditions. So I'd like to now show you a few projects, mappings, that have tried to embrace this idea of the mapping as a collective enabling activity. This is one by the artist Esther Polak, who worked with the Vark Society in Amsterdam, and she gave 60 residents of Amsterdam GPS units, which in 2002 were quite big, and told them over 40 days, just turn them on whenever you leave your house. Those people, their movements were registered via a central server onto a giant screen in the center of Amsterdam as wispy white traces. And over time, as more people walked through the city, those lines became thicker and brighter, and the plazas that were more traversed became red. And so what they ended up with was what Esther Polak called the most current map of Amsterdam, made by its residents. Here's another one by Christian Knoll. He's a London-based artist who works collaboratively with people, collaboratively. Gives them galvanic sensors, which are these things that test their stress levels as they walk through the city. And those are plotted, it's a detail of the Stockport emotion map, as he calls it. And those red bars, the high red bar is high stress, low red bar is low stress. So the map begins to identify where the stressful spots of the city are. Then he asked everyone to answer questions like, where are the most dangerous places in this city? Who are the most dangerous people? What are the lost histories of this place? You know, England's kind of a depressing place. What they ended up with this collaborative map of Stockport. This is one I've been doing with my students at UT down at Waller Creek, another deserted, desolate place, which is slated for some major renewal. Sent the students down there to observe what was going on and put those observations into a giant typographic collaborative map. The focus again being on the mapping, the being down in the space as a way of activating a dead space. Ute Eisenreich, an artist in the Netherlands, actually, when Gary threw out the thread, I thought he was going to do this with you guys. But she decided to make a social network map and gave red string to all these kids at Langmat School in the Netherlands and said, connect the red string to 3 people you'd like to invite to your birthday party. Then she gave white string and said, connect that to the person you know least well in your class. Yellow string, the person you'd most like to be. So kind of playing on the idea of envy. And then blue string, who's actually been to your house? So this gradually formed through a series of photographs, a notion, an aerial view of a social network that was constantly changing, something that's quite transient and fragile and subject to human emotions, which are things that aren't normally mapped. This map I can't really show you because it's secret. I can tell you about it. Kingsley Palmer, the researcher, went to the southern Pitjantjatjara region of Australia in 1981 because he was interested in the Aboriginal community there and their notion of maps and territories. They didn't think of the territory as a plot of land that was theirs. They saw it instead in terms of what they called dreaming tracks, or as Bruce Chatwin wrote about, song lines. So these long tracks that ran and formed giant networks through the land that the knowledge of was quite precise and sustained through stories and in an oral way. So it was an oral mapping. Kingsley Palmer decided to plot all that information on a conventional topographic map, and as a gift, he handed it back to the Aboriginal Australians. They were horrified. They said, you can't do this. This is sacred information. And they insisted it be put in a bank vault with the stipulation that only if 3 village elders showed up at the same time, could it be taken out? Well, lo and behold, it came to the point where the Australian government were negotiating with Aboriginal people about returning their land. And Kingsley Palmer showed up at a meeting and found that the Aboriginal folks had actually got a rolled-up piece of paper in their hand, which was his map. And when they were meeting with the politicians, they unrolled it and said, look, we've got it in your terms. These are the extents of our dreaming tracks. And they got some land back. So the point being that the knowledge map was the oral map, the mapping, but they had to translate it to the dominant terms of the regular map, the conventional map, in order to get the land back or to negotiate. This is a quote from Herman Melville's Moby Dick. It was walked by the artist Jeremy Wood across London, a 44-mile journey. It says, it is not down on any map, true places never, you can't really see the never, it's down there, are. So it is not down on any map, true places never are. I'd like to show you this because I think it's not an impulse or a suggestion that we stop mapping because they can't be trusted, but to encourage us to make more maps, because I do think that this amateurization of mapping is a good thing. The more mapping that goes on there, the more the boundaries are stretched and tested, the more the modes of representation are explored. And the best thing about it is you don't need a big GPS unit to do it anymore. You can do it on a smartphone. You don't even need a smartphone. You can do it with bits of paper. Anyone can map. So this amateurization of mapping has rescued the tools of cartography away from the experts and brought it to the people. So with that note, I'd like to encourage you all to go out and start mapping and leave you with the words of the late great geographer Dennis Cosgrove, who said, "Always make maps, always question maps." Thank you.